Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on AI and ethics, where we will take a closer look at how crucial trustworthy AI is to the widespread adoption of AI, also known as artificial intelligence. I will be joined by Carol Piovesan of INQ Law. Hi, Carol, thanks for joining us. Richard Zuroff of Blue Dot as of today. You may recall we promoted this webinar with Richard, who used to be with Data Robot. So I want to say congratulations, Richard, for the new opportunity you just embraced. We have Ashley Cassavan of Responsible AI Institute with us. And last but not least, it's Grace Abu Hamad of ServiceNow. So without further ado, I would like to encourage each of the panelists to introduce themselves, provide opening remarks, whatever you wish. And that happens in no particular order, but let me start off with you, Carol, and give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me on this panel, a very timely topic given all that's happening around the world. So my name's Carol Piovesan. I'm the managing partner of INQ Law. Very proud today to have been recognized as one of Canada's best law firms for cybersecurity and data protection by Globe and Mail. So that was a huge feat for us. The world of AI and data ethics is a world that we spend a lot of time working on supporting our clients in managing risk around the use of artificial intelligence and planning out their overarching AI governance structures and their frameworks. So very excited to be here today to talk about some of these key issues with the Chamber, its participants, and of course, my esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carol, and congratulations to you as well. So that is indeed fantastic news and so well deserved. I'm glad you're bringing this up because we all need to hear it and celebrate with you. So Richard, may I then hand the mic to you, please, for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, maybe I'll just give a little bit of the story of what brought me here. So I started my career in consulting, advising clients on strategy, but increasingly, this is a few years ago, all of the most interesting projects had to do with advanced analytics. So I ended up leaving, joining an AI company, and then after that, another company that was building an auto ML platform. And in both of those places, I was working on services components to complement the core software product and thinking about how our customers can get the most value and the best ROI out of the software. And doing that, I kept coming back to barriers to adoption. And it was pretty clear that having AI that wasn't trusted or wasn't trustworthy was a major barrier. So I spent a lot of time thinking about governance and other mechanisms you could have on both of those fronts, on making things more trustworthy and more trusted. But of course, you know, there's a lot to there. So as you said today, I have a new role, and so my relationship with AI ethics is actually a little different. So instead of working on the AI risk management side, I think of myself as working on what you might call AI for good, because Blue Dot does epidemic intelligence. So it helps governments in the private sector assess, detect, and respond to outbreaks using a mix of human intelligence. So it's an interesting change, but it's been a whole journey to get here. So yeah, excited to have this great chat with all the fellow panelists.
Well, thank you, Richard, and for sharing your journey and AI for good, tech for good. We will dive into that momentarily, so that sounds fantastic. And Ashley, over to you. The organization you're leading itself, Responsible AI Institute, tells us already a lot, so I'm curious and keen to learn more about you, your role, and please share your opening remarks, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here today and join these incredible, talented panelists that I'm with, and really to the Chamber for highlighting this work to the business community in Canada, I think is quite important. So happy to be here. No big announcements, unfortunately, but we're sort of just moving forward in the work that we do. So the Responsible AI Institute is a nonprofit organization. We're actually based in the US. However, I continue to remain in Canada and lead these efforts because it isn't the challenges that we're talking about today aren't specific to any region. They transcend physical borders and boundaries. And so I get that question a lot, but I think it's really quite important that we maintain these perspectives that we have and are able to think through them through our past experience, which in my case has really been from the public sector lens. So I was the director of data and digital for Treasury Board Secretariat at the Government of Canada. And in that capacity was responsible for leading the development of the directive on automated decision-making systems, which really reflected the path that we were moving towards both nationally and internationally, thinking of the implications of AI systems, similar to what Richard's already alluded to, and really thinking about how to incorporate those values and principles into then policy. And so I got to see not only the development of that, but the first round of implementation, and saw where some of those gaps existed, and really wanted to work at that intersection of really the panel that we have today, people doing research, people that are in industry, and then also practitioners like Carol that are really thinking about these things from a legal perspective or a risk assurance perspective combined with ethicists. And so all of those things, I think, fit really well into the opportunity to join a nonprofit that was able to convene those different voices. And the work that we're doing is focused on producing really similar private governance that complements the public governance that I did in the Canadian context. So even though it's a bit of a different role, it's really leading and building off of those different efforts. So I'm sure I'll talk more about it after.
Thank you, Ashley. And you said there isn't much to announce. You provided us with amazing news and insights on your organization. I think it's fantastic. And I do recall actually one data point you shared with me, that you've grown as well as an organization quite a bit. So that's a great news story, and kudos to you as the leader. So really pleased to have you here. And Grace, may I ask you to provide your opening remarks and insights? Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And of course, I'm honored to be part of a panel with people that I respect and admire. So this is a good, it's a great moment. Good way to start a Tuesday. I'm at ServiceNow in Montreal, and I'm a research scientist focusing on Trustworthy AI. I used to work with Richard when we were a startup and we were acquired by ServiceNow in January. My research focuses primarily on understanding the costs and benefits of building trustworthy systems, and also how organizations can think of this as a continuous improvement journey. One of the things that we learned over the past couple of years, in particular when I was working with Richard, is that there were a lot of companies that sought to adopt AI and they wanted to get into this space and they wanted to move fast, but they were limited in their overall maturity and resources and how to do that beyond just the getting the data and the tech set up. There's sort of a governance setup and an accountability setup that needs to be considered as well, and sort of and also even people awareness and training and that kinds of things. So we're now looking at how you can think of a trustworthy system as more than just the technology, and think of it as an overall framework for companies. And for me, this is interesting because when I got started in my career, I worked on internet architecture, accountability, and governance frameworks. So looking at this now from the AI side is just a sort of a way of moving up the layers of the internet. Very nerdy, but I'm excited about it. So look forward to talking about this a little bit more today.
Grace, thank you very much for your insights and comments, and sharing everybody here what you had to share. So let me continue with you, Grace, if I may. And you talked a lot about trustworthiness in your opening remarks, and Trustworthy AI. That's also a part of the title of today's session. What are the challenges, or some of them, with Trustworthy AI? And maybe to explain it a bit as well for those who listen into the session and say, what does that really mean, trustworthiness? So I just stay with you if you could please continue. Thank you so much.
Sure. I think, there's a world of term politics around the term that you use. Some people like to say responsible AI, some people like to say trustworthy AI, some people like to say ethical. I'm not married to any term, and I don't know if it's really worth going in and like negotiating the politics on each one of these. But when I think of trustworthy AI, I think of three big challenges. The first one is investment. When you think of building trust in a system, this is something that takes a long time, but can be generally with humans, right? Trust is something that takes a long time to build, but can be lost very easily. So the same applies to companies in this case, where right now they may see the biggest risk as a reputational risk or a scandal or something like that, but and may be hesitant to engage. But I think the risks are actually probably more than just reputational. There's a whole world of sort of the growing ESG concerns and otherwise, and this sort of a consumer demand for companies that are more responsible actors in society. And so beyond a reputational concern, I think it actually is a sort of a somewhat of an economic movement. And we've seen statements from big investors or sort of stock market leaders, et cetera, making that pivot, which means that for companies to be successful in the future, they may want to be investing in this a little bit more and not just for the sort of the PR reputational piece. But I think that investment, making that first step and making that investment jump in some ways is a challenge in this space. The other one I would say is control, probably is a second piece. This is in particular the enterprise level is more of an issue than maybe at the consumer level, because at the consumer level, you can nudge customers. You can't really control ultimately what your end user is doing, but you can certainly set up an interface or set them in a certain direction. For enterprise customers, when you're working with other businesses, they're the ones that engage directly with the end user. So your role as a company is a little bit more limited in how you can help them be more trustworthy actors in the space. So that's a challenge, maybe more particular to a company like ServiceNow, but that's something that that I work on quite a bit and I see as a challenge in the space. And then the third piece I would say is measurement. And again, this may be a little bit more of a nerdy point, but there's some aspects of trustworthiness that are difficult to measure. We've seen that in the world of privacy. What is private enough or not? What is secure or not? There may be some limits that you can work towards in security, for example, but in fairness, the term itself, when someone wants a system to be fair, the term itself is contested and there are different definitions of how you would do that. So you have to come up with a definition and a measurement that is agreed upon by enough people, and then you have to figure out how to measure that consistently over time. So there's some challenges there with, I would say, broadly the category of measurement, but we can get into the nitty-gritty as the panel goes on.
Yeah, thanks for that, because like you said, I read and heard a lot about and have been asked about what does responsible mean? What does trustworthy mean? Yeah, this is, we won't be able to figure this out today, I'm sure, but this is a very good conversation as there are so many terminologies that exist. Talking about differences, I'd like to ask you, Grace, in particular about the differences in sizes of companies. And as you alluded to, and I know Richard from that time too, you worked for Element AI before, now you're with ServiceNow. They're of different sizes, one smaller, one larger. So how differently do small versus opposed to large organizations invest in, let's say it again, trustworthy AI? What are the differences? Might there be similarities? So curious to hear about it. And also maybe you could bring in a global angle. Is there any Canadian and global difference if you wish? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think at Element AI, when the company was founded, that was founded sort of at this time where there was a rise in the responsible AI space, and this was sort of starting, let's say. So the company itself as a startup made this big bet that they would invest in responsible AI or trustworthy AI before the company really had a clear business plan or established revenue. And so I think that was a pretty bold choice on behalf of the company. It was a big choice on behalf of the founders. When you look at a larger company like ServiceNow, there's an established process, an established business plan. There's quarterly results to worry about, their stock prices, et cetera. So investing is also a bold choice. Investing in trustworthy AI is also a bold choice, but for different reasons. Mostly because the consequences of doing that incorrectly can be greater, have a greater effect on the company or have a greater impact possibly, right? So I think there's a little bit more caution in a more established business than there might be in a startup. And I personally was surprised to see that difference in my experience, because you would assume that a bigger business can take on more risk. And I think they can, but they do that in a different way than a startup would. But I think a challenge that exists maybe for both companies is that when you're trying to make that investment jump, you also are looking for the customer fit. And what I've seen a lot of is, and I think you've probably seen similar surveys, but a lot of surveys on responsible AI come up with these results like 70% of business leaders care about responsible AI and think it's important and make it a priority, et cetera. But in practice, I'm not sure that you're actually seeing the demand. And I think it's because it's very easy for people to say that they care about the topic, but then when it comes down to actually doing something, they're not sure how to do that, or they're not sure what the right way to act might be. So you get a lot of interest in the topic, but then not necessarily a lot of clear demand. And I think that was a challenge both at the startup and in a larger company.
Well, thank you so much. That's a lot of in-depth insight on so many levels, Grace. And actually, I find it interesting that you mention the assumption of a larger organization maybe being able to embrace more risk. And I have worked in different sectors and sizes of companies, and often actually smaller ones are more open to trying things and have maybe less hierarchy or processes and sometimes just go for it. So thanks for that comparison and insight. It's, of course, different for everyone, and but this is a great lesson learned. And maybe Carol, that brings me to the absolutely, you go for it.
I forgot to talk about the comparison between Canada and sort of maybe in the US, because that's just where ServiceNow is headquartered. But one thing I'll say is I'm an American citizen, moved to Canada to join Element at the time, and I think my understanding at least was that Montreal, or Canada in particular, had been investing pretty heavily in the responsible AI space, and that I don't know if you would maybe let my Canadian colleagues argue this, but I would say possibly that there was an investment, a Canadian position or an ideal that companies in Canada, or that the Canadian ecosystem would be the responsible AI ecosystem, in contrast perhaps to the American Silicon Valley tech approach. So, I don't think every company fits into either one of those stereotypes or categorizations, but at least to me, that was part of it, is that Canada was trying to establish itself as the lead globally on responsible AI and trustworthy AI. And I think you do see a lot of companies in Canada and a lot of research in Canada focusing in that direction, more so possibly than in the US. Or at least the US is maybe trying to catch up more now than it was a couple of years ago.
Well, thanks for that addition, Grace, which is very crucial as we move going back to Carol, because Carol, you also have some insights on comparisons globally, and that brings us to the regulatory landscape, actually. So what is the current regulatory landscape, if I may ask, for AI in Canada? And then, well, around the world, you may focus on specific markets. The globe is a big place. So you choose whatever you may wish.
Sure. And let me just start by saying I agree with Grace that Canada is trying to position itself as a leader in ethical AI. If I had a crystal ball, I would also say that Canada is going to position itself as a leader in standards and certifications. And my guess is you'll be able to thank Ashley for that. So the regulatory landscape is actually quite fluid. We're in a space right now where tying back to Grace's points, I really love the 3 points she made. I want to underscore them because what she was saying is you look at investments, control, and measurements as some of the big challenges that companies are facing. And I would like to add to that the regulatory complexity from a data privacy and now technology perspective. So the risks around reputational harm are forever known and they're quite extensive. But increasingly, we're actually seeing greater risks around litigation, so actual lawsuits stemming from the use of data and artificial intelligence, more clarity about the impact of that litigation, and then harsher fines associated with noncompliance. In Canada, the landscape for data is quite fluid. We know that prior to the election, there was Bill C-11 that was tabled that would substantially reform our privacy laws. With the election, obviously that bill died on the order table, but we expect it to be revived in short order. So we do see that there is some change at the federal level to adapt our privacy laws with a view to how data is being accumulated and used, AI being one of those uses. Quebec has already led. They actually passed their bill 64. They now have reformed privacy law that specifically includes elements of automated decision-making regulation. And then we see some really interesting guidance out of British Columbia as well as Ontario. That's really, they've put together a task force trying to understand the use of artificial intelligence and trying to better determine what types of parameters need to be in place in order to regulate and govern AI. This is nothing new when you look globally. So the European Union, at the risk of going too far, too fast, but the European Union has tabled draft legislation to govern artificial intelligence. And if that sounds boring, which I totally appreciate that being for some, let me just say that the fines associated with noncompliance with that law, should it come to pass, are greater than what you find under the General Data Protection Regulation or Europe's data protection law. So that signals to you the degree to which the union is worried about the use of these technologies and what steps they're taking to try to mitigate that risk. Finally, out of the United States, we've seen a lot of talk and increasingly number of bills being considered to govern artificial intelligence. Just yesterday, I posted about a New York bill to require companies to prove that their AI is non-biased. Now, going to Grace's point of, how do you measure that? That can be pretty interesting to measure. Well, New York says you can and you will, and then you're going to tell us what you found. So we've seen guidance out of the FTC, the GAO, and NIST. These are all interesting bodies that are coming forward, as well as at the state level. All to say, the regulatory environment, as I said, is extremely fluid, recognizing specific risks to do with the use of artificial intelligence, which is very broadly defined. It does not have a single definition. It actually has a range of definitions across different jurisdictions. So something to keep on your radar as you continue to build your AI systems as well as your governance program.
Well, Carol, thanks for this. And moving into organizations, and you just mentioned governance. So let me then have a follow-up question and ask you, how do organizations operationalize AI governance? And what does AI governance look like? Good governance. So what do you have to share with us there?
So I was in a really interesting conversation with an AI governance tech company the other day, and we were about an hour into the conversation where we stepped back and realized that we're using the word governance in two totally different ways. So governance to a lawyer versus governance to an engineer are two totally different definitions, or at least they're applied in very different ways. So from my perspective, what governance looks like, it is to all those in the audience who have built out your privacy management program and your cybersecurity safeguards, it is the policies and procedures, the overarching framework, the ethical principles that guide what you do and how you do it. It is the organizational accountability and readiness. And there are some elements of that governance structure that you already have, particularly if you are GDPR compliant. You already have them. You may have to tweak some with the specific view to the regulation and the harms associated or the risks associated with artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done to figure out what those are. And then there are some that are unique, right? That you will have to create because they haven't yet been created and they will benefit you down the line. So one policy that I often talk about, or a few, having your explainability framework in place. Explainability is a requirement or an emerging requirement in a number of different jurisdictions. Can you explain why a certain output was rendered? And if not, why? So you have to provide some decision tree or some mechanism that you will have to decide, because we don't have a ton of guidance out there. We do have some, but not a ton, as to what your explainability framework and criteria will look like, and also a justification for that. So that might be something that you don't necessarily have under GDPR, although you might under their profiling provisions. And so, you know, there's that component of policies, procedures, but the other really important component that I would love to underscore here is the importance of the human capital. So and I think Grace touched on this, you know, we talk a lot about the technology, but that's actually not your biggest risk. Your biggest risks are the people around the technology, either being impacted by it or using it or developing it. That's your biggest risk. And so investing in your human capital, investing in training, understanding, cross-functional teams so that you don't end up 1 hour into a conversation realizing that you're using the same word in two very different ways. That's one of your greatest investments that you can make early on in your AI governance structure.
Thank you, Carol. That reminds me actually a bit of conversations around cybersecurity, the biggest risk, right? People and technology, how they use it. Do they use it responsibly? Are they well, you know, educated on it and regularly informed? So lots of connections there. Talking about connections and relations. Richard, you're actually up next in that context, because you and I spoke about how things are related to one another. And we discussed some very interesting questions there. So the first one I have for you in this context is, what are the different elements of responsible AI and how are they related?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, some of this was already touched on, but I think that it's worth sort of taking a step back to think about maybe why it can be challenging for organizations to stitch all of these different pieces together. And I think it also comes from, you know, discussions about language and confusion. So, you know, you hear discussions about ethical AI sometimes in the context of like philosophy. So, you know, academic questions about long tail risks, alignment of AGI, existential risk, which I think is like worth, you know, it's good that somebody is looking at it, but it's very different from what Carol was talking about legal rules that are coming out at the sub-national level, at the national level, at the supranational level. You've got standards bodies that are then trying to fill in some of the gaps. So I think, you know, a lot of the legislation that I've seen is pretty clear on what the goals are. So, you know, be fair, be explainable, you know, be transparent, but there's a lot of clarity about the how. And so I think standards bodies and others are trying to fill in some of those gaps on the how, but then you also have those internal mechanisms. So things, for example, in the finance realm, you would already have model risk management departments. They're used to it. But in many other places, those are relatively new. And so what I see is, there are all these different pieces that I think organizations are trying to stitch together to figure out where there are overlaps, where there are differences. And you had mentioned organizations of different sizes, and I think that comes into it too. So if you've got customers and data coming from different countries, if you've got use cases in different industries, then you're going to have a whole wider set of potential regulations or standards that actually apply to you. Versus if you are a smaller startup, then you may be able to sort of concentrate your efforts a little bit more clearly to say, okay, something like the EU AI Act says we're not in a high risk industry, so most of this is just best practice. We can figure out what best practices are, for example. So I think that there are lots of different connections to them. I think that the more that we see those connections, so we see legal rules being influenced by good sort of high level thinking about philosophy, we see standards filling in the gaps for the legal side, and then we see internal governance mechanisms actually putting all of that into place is better. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to connect all of those different pieces.
Well, and talk about more work to be done and connecting more pieces, Richard. You had also given me a great idea on asking and connecting profitable AI and responsible AI. What's the relation? I mean, I think you noted like responsible AI is a bit more the social success, and then the profitable would be more the business success. But I guess they belong all together, because how can a business success be a business success without the social, right? So looking forward to hearing from you about this connection and relation, however you may want to explain it, of course.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to it. I guess the way I think about it is, you hear a lot of talk about the ROI, the return on investment from AI, and how to make sure that the investments that people and businesses are making are actually generating impact. And I think that's a good starting point, and sometimes can be challenging enough. But where we should be trying to get to is risk-adjusted ROI. So if I go back to the finance analogy again, you have investments that may generate a good return, but have high volatility. So something like crypto. And you have others that maybe have a slightly lower return, but much less risk. So maybe, real estate, maybe not in Toronto, but in other places. And so you have metrics like a Sharpe ratio that captures, as an investor, whether you're actually making good decisions, or if you're just taking on more risk than someone else. And I think it should be something similar in AI. So you want to think about the good outcomes and the bad potential outcomes. So maybe it's X dollars if this works, or $0 if it fails, or maybe it's X dollars if it works and like negative Y dollars, negative externalities, negative utility if it fails. And I think that if you start thinking about that risk lens incorporated, you can think about the baseline, think about what it might be, and then it sort of gives you a way of thinking about, bringing those two halves together, what the impact might be, what the cost might be. But actually, Grace might have something to say about this too, because I know she's thinking about cost and benefits too. So.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I'm not sure, Grace, if you want to answer, or if I may move over to Ashley and ask her to provide her insights, or do you have something quick to share?
No, I'd say let's, in the interest of time, let's go to Ashley. I know there's a lot of questions coming through on Slido too.
Oh, there are, and that is very exciting. This is a really interactive conversation. So, Ashley, we talked about leading up to the session. I mean, what in terms of harmful AI, or the questions, why would AI want to do harm, or what is the harmful aspect in that context? Are there any examples where it could be harmful that help the audience understand what the challenges, risks could be, and issues?
Yeah, and maybe in doing so, I've been scanning the questions within the chat. And so I think that people really are interested in very practical examples and applications. And I think, unfortunately, I'm not going to promote any one application over another, but would say that applications that are going to provide good services is one of the questions to Canadians, would be a application that's gone through a review, and ensuring a responsible AI review, ensuring that a lot of the components that my fellow panelists have spoken about are really thought about in these contexts. And when they're not, that's when we can see a lot of unintentional harms that can occur from these systems. And so maybe just a couple quick examples that we've seen in the news recently. Just this past week, the week before maybe, Zillow, which is an example in the US context, was an AI system that they had an AI that buys and sells houses. And what we saw was that for one example, a person's house was sold at $500,000 in 1 week, and then the next week it was bought back by the exact same seller for $350,000. And so as a result of some transactions like this, that were predicting and automatically selling and buying, then there was a harm to the company in this case. But what resulted that people aren't talking about as much is that there's people behind that company. And so then a whole wing of this company was shut down as a result, and people lost their jobs because they decided to end the use of that application. And in having some conversations recently, people were like, well, nobody, like in this case, the buyers were not harmed, but it could have easily been the reverse. And I think this example is really important because there were a lot of discussions that spoke after the fact of how this is why we need more explainability in how these AI systems are making decisions. And that's a point that Carol's touched on already. And I think that is important. In this case, though, really looking at it more holistically, in explainability being one of the attributes. You've asked earlier about what does responsible AI mean? And I agree with my fellow panelists that there's politics around some of these terms that we use. However, so not to get into that, as per the name of our institute, we've chosen one. But we think about that, though, in terms of having a consistent and comprehensive framework for that. So explainability being one of those components, accountability, which Carol and others have mentioned, that includes the governance mechanisms, ensuring compliance with regulations. And those regulations, it's not just for the sake of having protocols in place, it's so that things like Equal Opportunity Act, which is to one of Carol's other points, the New York State bill is requiring the testing of bias specifically around, I think if we're talking about, and sorry, it's New York City, not New York State, is requiring testing of bias for automated human resource systems. And so these are things that when we're talking about governance, it's adherence or compliance with existing laws like Equal Opportunity Act that exist, and understanding how that gets integrated into your process. Grace mentioned privacy as another example of one of those components. And then we also think that it's really important to look at things like robustness of your system. And so in the case of Zillow, my particular issue with it, I think, was related to the changing nature or dynamic nature of the system. And so that was, is this model continuing to behave as is expected to? And so having appropriate ongoing monitoring mechanisms to ensure that that's taking place is a component of that. Similarly, we also think of the bias and ensuring, we've talked about this already on this panel, that certain types of tests are performed to ensure that fairness is demanded in this system. And I think this goes to Grace's opening or comments in her first question, really related to those ESG objectives that we see in here. So all this to say is that that kind of gives you an understanding of what we're talking about when we say what responsible AI actually means. And so, in my opinion, any sort of system that ensures those things is a good system that will provide better services, because it also results in just good engineering practices. And so, and when those are not followed, then that's where those harms like a lack of fairness exist. In the case of New York State's, I keep saying New York State, New York City's bill is because they want to make sure that hiring applications are fair to everybody that's entering into that process. And so we can see AI does a whole variety of these things. You can see then if those components are not followed that I spoke to, then harms either intentionally or unintentionally could occur if those processes are not put in place.
Yeah, thank you. And Ashley, something you and I had discussed during this entire context is, so thinking about it, you mentioned bias, the challenges, explainability, transparency, and so forth. Why are we delegating such critical decisions to machines then?
Well, I think at the end of the day, all of us are probably here because we believe that technology helps advance our society. It provides better services to the public. If you're the public sector, to your clients. If you're in the private sector, it helps us make better inferences. We were talking earlier about Richard's new job, and they were the first to detect the pandemic or identify like the power of data being combined in these different machinations, and to not only predict, but to help just improve service delivery in many of its different functions is incredibly beneficial. I think what's important, though, is we want to make sure that these systems are not being built on data or processes, because that's an algorithm is a process, it's a protocol for how it's processing that data. And so that they're not built in a way that is going to perpetuate some of the challenges that could exist, and also that there's appropriate oversight mechanisms in place for that. And so these are things that we really need to be thoughtful of when we're designing these systems, because they are going to help us, like any technology, improve how we operate. I think there's a ton of potential for identifying some opportunities related to climate change, and then hopefully rectifying some of that. So some of these big challenges that we have in front of us, I do think that technology can help us with, for sure.
Looking into the future, what's on the horizon for AI? I mean, Carol, can I ask you, how will going forward AI impact change organizations? Well, what do you foresee?
Well, I mean, if you believe what some business leaders are saying in the tech world, AI will impact all of what we do. So it really is. Listen, we're using a term. This is very common when you've got a word that is used so often it starts to lose its meaning. Like, we're talking about a technology that augments our potential. So when you've got a technology that's able to process data much faster, much more, with a particular, with a view to identifying trends and identifying a particular output, it can be extremely useful. Not to mention where you've got an ability then to action on that output. So you've got a particular prediction, then you take an action. You being a system can take an action on that prediction, and then things can happen without necessarily a human involved. So there's really, when you look at it, both from its simplest form according to definitions, I like definitions, So when I look at the definition of artificial intelligence at law right now, or at least what's being proposed, it can be something that is considered still sophisticated, but much simpler than a self-driving car, to something that can be actually quite complicated and robotic. So you've got a huge spectrum that you're dealing with. And that means that you've got technology that can start to manage all sorts of different tasks and activities that we do, and make it much easier for us to get those tasks done so that we can focus our time on other things. In which case, the future will include artificial intelligence in its broadest form in all aspects of what we do. And so the question really becomes, are we sufficiently training and understanding what this technology is and how it can be extremely beneficial and truly augment our capabilities and our potential, but also where it can be harmful? I mean, we've heard examples of how we don't want to perpetuate former, forms of discrimination into the future. That's not the intention, in which case we have to be thoughtful and walk in with our eyes wide open to understand how this could happen. There was a question in the chat about, what are some of the best skills for AI to be a great human decision maker for artificial intelligence? Well, I think the first thing is to really understand the technology, understand the data. Actually, you don't even need to start understanding how algorithms are created. We have to just start understanding, I think, statistics, right? A lot of us don't even have that mathematical background to really understand how data is analyzed and the impact of those numbers. If we start there, we already start to see that numbers are not neutral. So we have to look behind those numbers and start really asking some critical questions about what the data is telling us, even sometimes in its simpler form. And then you can start to see how you go down the line of education and educate and really try to wrap your head around where some of those harms can be. I really hope the Chamber one day puts on a panel having to do with the legal challenges of artificial intelligence, because there's a whole discussion about what makes AI unique at law and why the law is struggling with this technology. There was one question about copyright as well. So there's a whole really interesting discussion beyond the scope of this particular panel, but it just goes to sort of underscore that even though we need a lot of education, we also need the right rules of engagement. And as companies, as leaders, organizational leaders, we actually need to wrestle this in, understand it, and then take action that we think is defensible and appropriate in the circumstances, recognizing you will be judged on it at some point.
Maybe if I can just add one thing to what Carol's saying that I think is very important to emphasize, because there's a lot, is that in relation to these skills and needing to know data, I would say that that's an important component. Of course, I think that is a skill that needs to happen organizationally. I don't think we're easily going to go from all of this data literacy and every single person needs to have it. And that's one of the things that really motivated me to do the work that I'm doing now, that I saw in the government of Canada, is that people that were subject matter experts in how to improve benefits, and they don't now also need to know what's the best type of AI system, what are these different statistical tests for bias. It's too much burden to add to one person. But what we need to do, which is what Carol's been talking about this whole time, and Grace mentioned, and Richard, of course, as well, this culture thread is so important, so that the engineers can have the same conversation with the people that are thinking about how to improve benefits and access to Canadians. Or there was a question about immigration. And it's a perfect example of where Canada has a backlog of people that want to come into this country, and we are going to see more of this with climate refugees. And so we really want to have a process in place and we can leverage AI in a positive way, but we need those people all communicating and talking together. And I think that a common vocabulary amongst these different disciplines is a new skill set or training that needs to be adopted within organizations.
Yeah, is it okay if I build on that?
Right away, go for it.
I completely agree. And I think going back to the question, though, it's an interesting one. The way it's framed, it's sort of taking the AI as a given and saying, how can I adapt myself best to that? And that's a reasonable question. But I think also a lot of the value of AI is in having it act in more naturalistic ways. And I think that the point that was made is that like that's oftentimes as the designer or the employer of these systems, you should be thinking about the ways to use the subject matter expertise that you have. So I'll give an example from Blue Dot. This is a system that looks at 300,000 different data sources every day, but then it filters those down, and there's a team of epidemiologists that looks at a curated list and then tries to understand what those mean. And so those epidemiologists don't have to necessarily know a lot about AI. They have to have that cultural fluency that we were talking about, but it's about how do you design it to say, we have the subject matter expertise, you already have skills. So how do we design AI systems that make the best use of those skills rather than either, competing or exploiting?
And Grace, please, you wanted to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, since everyone's jumping in, thank you. I figured, well, I guess just the point that kind of that builds on what everyone was saying, I think is maybe a little bit controversial, but the future that I would like to see for trustworthy AI is that we don't actually call it trustworthy AI. We don't put that adjective in front of it because we would have built that in the sort of the governance and the accountability into the technology itself. It's this idea that, we don't allow anymore for bridges to be built if they're going to be unsafe, right? We shouldn't allow that for this technology either. I mean, the analogy may not be 100% in this case, but ultimately, like, we should be looking at a more horizontal application versus a vertical one. And I think right now the world is very much in this sort of vertical application. I'm on the trustworthy AI team within a company, right? Like, that shouldn't be the case moving forward.
Just by having the term, it already describes basically a little bit the challenge almost. Thank you, first of all, for wrapping in and bringing in the questions into the conversation. So it's such an organic flow. Anything you wish to add at this point in time to that conversation? Anybody on the panel?
Sure.
Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that Grace's point is actually what we should all be saying. It's not controversial at all. It is the goal. We don't talk about, and I think the analogy works. Maybe we're both wrong, but we don't want to go on bridges that aren't safe. We're having these same conversations as it relates to social media now and those mechanisms. But I want to go back to a point that she made early on is we need to define what that means. Engineers have standards and controls in place for what a safe bridge is. There's different types of tests and evaluations that are performed and done. And I don't think that we can have them for AI systems writ large, but we do need to think about those different types of tests and standards that are required for the various different AI applications that exist. And so one of the things that I'm getting asked a lot these days is AI the right term? Like, it's never been the right term, but it's that's why we called the directive automated decision-making systems, because it was about those types of AI applications. That said, it brings us all together to have those discussions. And I think now that we move forward, we need to think about, by those types of systems, what's the appropriate division, but what's the appropriate standards for that. And I do hope, as Carol said at the beginning, that Canada has the opportunity to kind of lead that, because I do think that this brings in value-based type discussions that need to be had. And I just personally would like to see Canada's values reflected in those efforts.
I'd love to add something.
Or Carol, anyone, go ahead.
I just want to add quickly on the point of the human capital. We keep harping on it, but there's a good reason for it. I always caution, we have a lot of clients reaching out, asking us questions about AI governance and how do you do it and what does it look like? How do you manage appropriate risk? And one of the points I'm always keen to make is, don't situate yourself as one player in a small pond. Like, recognize that you are part of something that is changing. So when you're making ethical and responsible decisions, you're doing so not for your particular little system and your particular little company or big company. You have to step back and look at the implications of what you're doing. It's not to take on too much. You don't need to be Atlas, but you just need to really think about what you're advancing and why, and then put yourself on the cover of any favorite newspaper and say, would I feel confident justifying this? And if your answer is yes, then go forth and conquer. But if your answer is no, then figure out why and fix it early, because the sort of downstream ramifications can be very intense, not only for your own company, but if we do hold it up to sort of increasing ESG investments and what that means, then it actually has a broader impact on your sector and ultimately what you're doing in your society. So I hate casting it so high, but I actually think it's really important to be really practical about what you're thinking and contextualize it.
Great. The word practical, I'm sure, works for many people. And this is where absolutely. And, because how is it actionable, implementable, and so forth, and practical? This is like you want to take something home or away after such a session, right? And be stimulated, and then look, as you said, Carol, for version 2.0 of another session, which I gladly take upon myself. This is a great recommendation. Thank you so much to this entire group, Ashley, Grace, Carol, Richard, for not only today's participation, but the many email exchanges and also conversations we had leading up to this panel discussion. There is more to come. This is such an important topic. We've seen it in the chat function with all the questions. We've seen it in this conversation. This is really just the beginning. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us for today's conversation, for being so engaged and asking these very important questions. We hope to see all of you at one of our upcoming sessions.